we're going to have a little bit of fun before we start. It's a personal story about my experience. I had a great friend who was a superb speaker of English, spoken beautifully, very fluently, very accurately, but just occasionally he stressed a particular word in a rather curious way. And I particularly remember the occasion on which he came out with the word "particularly." He said it in such an alarming way that I completely failed to recognize what the word was. And I remember that the next few sentences he spoke, I didn't hear them. I was racking my brain to make out what "particularly" meant. "Particularly" doesn't sound like any particular English word, does it? But when he put the stress in this very unexpected place, at the very beginning of the word, and on an unstressable syllable, and said "particularly," then I couldn't recognize it before. So those are moral stories about rhythm in English, right? Now we'll get on to the real topic. Okay? The topic today, and this is the most important of my 3 lectures, because, well, it's so important because it concerns so many of the words you have to use. Now, not so many different words. In fact, we're only going to talk this morning, essentially, about 40-odd words. There are 2 sets of words. They're the words that have contractions. There are about 60 of those. And they're the words that have weak form. And there are about 45 or so of those. Now, 45 to 50, that kind of number. So we're dealing with not much more than 100 words, and yet every time anybody carries on a conversation in English, every 4th word will be one of the words off that sheet, one of those 100 or so words on that page. So that means it's a quarter of all the words you utter if you're speaking English. Now, that's obviously very important in quantitative terms, but it's also important for this reason. They are the hardest words to master the pronunciation of, because they vary their pronunciation so constantly. At least the weak form, the 45 or 50 weak form. They vary them in a rather intricate way that's difficult to learn. And that no non-native English speaker, no English as a foreign language student ever gets right, except after very careful and long study. I don't care what kind of English you're speaking, but if you're aiming as your model a native English type and not a foreign type, if you are aiming at general American or general Australian, educated Australian or New Zealand or South Africa, we all share practically all these usages. Now that you know there are enormous differences in the vowel systems in America, well, not enormous, but certainly there are very notable and important differences between the way vowels are operated in America and in Australia and here and so on. We switch vowels around between Australia and here, and Americans haven't got one of our vowels at least, and they distribute others differently, so that there are quite complex things that are different. But we understand each other perfectly. Never have any problem whatsoever in understanding an educated British person. Immediately and easily understands an educated Australian and an educated American. Why? Well, because we have so much in common, and it's not necessarily all in the vowels and consonants. It's in the rhythm of a sentence. And now our whole topic, really, for these 3 lectures is basically the rhythm of English, and what kind of distortions that EFL learners are likely to produce, and how that diminishes their ability to be easily understood. So now here's the most important group of words that affect the rhythm of English, because they occur so often, and because they change their nature according to the rhythm of the sentence. And what happens in speaking is rhythm is a very important element of language, because rhythm tells you something that the words don't tell you. The words in a sentence that you can write on a piece of paper will tell you the meaning, it'll tell you the subject and what's being said about the subject, that kind of thing. But the rhythm tells you not just what's being said about it, but how it groups, how the speaker thinks of it, which things he links and which things he separates. The rhythm, the pauses he makes, the binding together rhythmically by squeezing things together and saying them smoothly and quickly in one unit, which is what people are doing all the time, is expounding, is telling you what the grammar of his sentence is explaining to you things that you need to know about how he understands the words he's using, how he links them with each other. Now, in order to do that, as I pointed out to you yesterday, English is absolutely the top of the scale of neglecting what they feel to be unimportant and of giving all attention to the important words, pouncing on the important syllables. Now this means the most neglected words are the words that have least importance, the ones that provide this grammatical framework. They are the words that have weak form. It's very important subject, which is basically rhythm, the alternation of strong and weak. So, now the textbooks are not very good on defining weak form because they only pay attention to the weak forms you must operate with. So we have thousands of weak forms. But luckily for you, although we've got thousands of words, probably the majority of words, certainly the majority of the polysyllabic words, the words of more than one syllable in the language, undergo weakening constantly. But you don't need to bother with that because it's optional. You can do it if you want to, but you don't have to. So, safest thing for you is to forget it and aim always to use the dictionary form of the word. But you can't do that and sound at all normal or natural if you don't remember to operate weak forms of these words I'm focusing attention on now. And you see that I grouped them for you on that sheet I gave you yesterday into word classes. You'll find there a group of determiners, a group of prepositions, at, for, from, of, and to, a group of verbs, and a group of pronouns and so on. They're the commonest words in use in the English language. And so we keep on changing their form. So here's your definition then. It's an alternate form of a word, the weak form, that's so reduced in its articulation that it consists of a different set of phonemes. And now, the point is that happens to an enormous number of words, but you can forget all the ones except the ones on my list. And even those don't have to be operating with weak forms all the time. They're the ones that I label the stylistically distinctive ones. In other words, you produce not non-English, but the wrong style if you fail to use it. You may sound perfectly English, but you might sound like somebody who is very unhappy or very formal or very deliberate about what he has to say, instead of normally, naturally, comfortably using the language. It sounds stiff, stilted. Now, as I was doing yesterday, I want to illustrate for you what it sounds like in an extreme case. So in my third paragraph here, I'm going to first of all read that to you as I would say it normally. Notice I've marked it for intonation, so I shall try and keep to the rhythm and intonation that I would have anyway, and I'll only, in the second version of it, I'll only say it with the wrong form, in other words, strong forms instead of weak forms, which will ruin the rhythm, in fact. But here we go. Let's have the normal way first. I shall have to try and get some cash from the bank at lunchtime so they can have the money that they want as soon as possible. What do they expect us to pay them? So they can have the money they want as soon as possible. What do they expect us to pay them? Now that sounds completely normal English. Anybody might utter in that way in the middle of a conversation. Now here it is, as typically spoken, if you like, by the worst EFL student. I shall have to try and get some cash from the bank at lunchtime so that they can have the money that they want as soon as possible. What are they expecting us to pay them? Well, didn't it sound rattly? That's certainly the way we feel when people speak that way. And most of the time, most EFL learners tend to do that because they learn the strong form of the word in the first place and they cling to that and they forget, don't notice that we operate this system weak form. I'll give you another example that I've taken from one of the tutors here, Claire Fletcher. She said, she quoted this one, "It is 10 to 12. I would not have given it to him if I had known that he would not like it." Now that's terribly un-English, terribly rattling. What should sound like is 10 to 12. I wouldn't have given it to him if I'd known he wouldn't like it. But it's so often pronounced, it is 10 to 12. I would not have given it to him if I had known that he would not like it. So don't do it that way, do it the normal way. Now, I don't say that English never sounds rattling, but really it's very rare that it sounds. I've given you one silly example of how it might sound rattling in English, but this is a very exceptional English sentence. It's, I've got a packet of cricket, it's in my jacket pocket. That does sound. That does sound rattling, but that's the sound effect you make on us if you keep on using strong forms. Right, so I'm going on now to illustrate that not only do you sound wrong and unnatural and abnormal in the rhythm you're using, but just occasionally you can even totally change the meaning of the sentence. And I've got a few sentences that come in that category here. And we'll have a chance for you to test yourself out and see if you can see the difference. I'm now going to read the sentence in line 7 there, paragraph 7. I'm going to read the sentence in 2 ways. And there'll be one very small difference in rhythm, but a big difference in meaning. Now, here we go. The present I'm giving him is a painting that I shall have done by Christmas. Way number 1. Way number 2. The present I'm giving him is a painting that I shall have done by Christmas. Now, the first way, the person who was speaking was not doing the painting himself. He was paying somebody else to do the painting. In the second way, the person who was speaking was the painter. Now, did you gather that? Were you tuned in enough to the way English speakers hear things from each other? Do you want to hear it again? Just once more. The present I'm giving is a painting that I shall have done by Christmas. That's, I'm paying for it to be done. Second way, the present I'm giving him is a painting that I shall have done by Christmas. And not much different, but that one key word. Now, which is the word? Yet it's the word have in I shall have done. If have is an important verb, if it's the main verb of a sentence, if it's the word a causative verb, I'll make sure that it's done. It's far too important to reduce so it has its strong form, have. If it's only an auxiliary verb conjugating, supplying the past tense here, then it's not important enough. So the speaker reduces it to I shall have done by Christmas. So there's one way you can totally change the meaning. Now, the second one, number 8 here. These books are awful. And then the reply comes, 2 of them are all right, or 2 of them are all right, and one of those replies, that is, 2 of them are all right, means I agree with you. And the other one, 2 of them are all right, means I disagree with you. Now, did you get that? Can you follow that? Did that immediately spring to you that it was obvious? Any native speaker would feel it was quite obvious. And if I say 2 of them are all right, then 2 of them are is the way I'd say that sentence before I get to the adverb at the end, the way I'd say that as a separate sentence and a separate unit of rhythm, and it would end with the word are. And that word are at the end of the sentence, or the end of a written group, is not reduced, not put into weak form. The 2 of them are means I agree about 2 of them, right? But 2 of them are all right. Now, instead of ending the sentence with an adverb which is really detached from the rest, mentally at least, you say 2 of them are all right. Now, all right is the complement of the verb. Now, are all right is a grammatical unit. Not 2 of them are with almost a pause. You could pause, or at least you slow down enough to say are instead of verb. And that rhythmic signal warns people that 2 of them are all right means I disagree with you. I've read 2 of those books and they're all right. I like them. So again, an enormous difference by a small rhythmical difference between are and verb. Number 9, well, I set a trap for myself with this one, and I was reading a passage with my class last week, and one of them said, "You've been in that room 4 hours," and I really had forgotten that I'd written. In fact, I'd written that somebody's supposed to be inside a bathroom. You know, somebody else waiting to get in the bathroom, and they said, "Come on out, you've been in there 4 hours." And of course, I replied to, "I've been in there 4 hours, and I haven't even been in there 1 hour." Yeah? Because 4 hours is bound to mean 4, a number. Because no native speaker would ever use the strong form of the word for in front of a word like ours. Whenever you get one of those 5 prepositions, add for, from, of, to, and put it, not all prepositions, remember, 5, remember the list, look at the list, but there are 5 prepositions which regularly, always, when they come before a noun phrase they're attached to, they're always reduced to a very weak version. In this case, it's referred to the vowel schwa. So, if you said the speaker asked 4 questions, right, and you use the strong form, then people would think you're saying the number of questions that were asked. And here's another one. I couldn't imagine if you read this to any native English speaker. I've only known it 4 weeks, but he's known it 4 months. I've very often heard EFL use a strong form in those cases, but I don't think any native English speaker hearing those sentences would even guess that they use a strong form. So be careful of that. Right, what's number 11? Well, he's going too fast. I've heard this suggested, had this said, when I've asked an EFL student to read aloud, he is about to abstain from food, right? To fast. Fast is the verb to fast means to eat little food or eat no food. Well, obviously that wasn't what they came out, wasn't what was intended. To fast, because the person who read it didn't use the weak form of to, it's something like the adverb to, too fast, T-double-O. And of course, he's going too fast sounds like a description of somebody exceeding the speed limit on the motorway rather than about to go without food. A different meaning altogether. Number 12, I was 18 months. You notice we don't say a year and a half, we say 18 months. I was 18 months before I could walk. And the reply, I was 2. Now, if an EFL learner said that, it could very well mean I too could be, I also was 18 months before I could walk. But in fact, if it's said with the form intended, the meaning is I was 2, so it means I was 6 months older than the other person. And the contrast, that is 18 months and 2 years. So I was 2 has to become I was 2, if you want to use the numeral 2, and not the adverb T-double-O. Another one, complete change of meaning. Number 13 is the kind of sentence you might hear in an airport, right? Somebody says, which flight are you taking? And now flights can be categorized in more than one way. You can give a letter or a number to it, or you can mention the time it's leaving, time it's taking off. And so if you say the 526, then the mental picture will be 3 numerals, 5, 2, and 6. He won't think for a moment that you mean the 5 to 6, the one that is 5 minutes before 6, 5:55. Because that's not the way he'd say it. That's not the way any native English speaker would say it. They all agree on reducing these words. Right. Now the next one, I taught for 19 years at the University of Leeds, and while I was teaching there one day, one of the students came in and he said he had upset his landlady, and we tried to find out what had happened. In fact, it was at breakfast time. He had offended her because he'd said, I'd like bread and butter. And, well, he harmlessly meant he'd just like to have bread and butter. But having said it, with the strong form of and a rather ambiguous prosody so that it almost sounded to the landlady as if he was emphasizing and, she thought that he was suggesting that the last time she'd given him bread and butter, there was so little butter on it that he wasn't worth calling bread and butter. But you realise, don't you, that bread and butter is an idiomatic expression. Bread and butter, in English, of course, is not a loaf of bread and a packet of butter. It is a slice of bread which has had butter spread on it. So it's very idiomatic meaning. And in that sense, bread and butter, of course, is those two things. But bread and butter is a totally different thing, and no native English speaker would ever say and in the middle of that. He'd always reduce it, and the weak form of and there have no D, and usually no schwa either. Just a syllable again, bread and butter. So, these are problems you can arise if you don't think about these. And the last example, it can occur if you don't use a weak form. There is a word that, the relative pronoun, relative adverb, that, which is always pronounced with schwa, right? And there is this other word, a demonstrative pronoun, demonstrative adjective, so that, as I say, look at that over there. Now, we have a funny little idiom by which, when we refer to a person, and we want to refer to the person that somebody else we know knows, but we're expressing disapproval of him, and we say, I expect that John told him, that John means that John we both don't like. Right? So, be careful, be careful. No, it has to be the weak form. If it's a relative, the John, nobody ever used to form that for the relative. It's always that with schwa, with that particular vowel. Now, the last one in this little set series is a sort of warning. It's a warning to you that you must very carefully take account of which of the words that have to have weak form, and also when they have weak form, because many words don't have their weak forms all the time. And the word some is an important item. Now, the word some, when it's normally pronounced, in its most frequent use, is put immediately in front of a noun, and it means they have to mean a quantity or an amount of. So we talk about some butter, some bread, some time, and so on. But when the word some means not a quantity of, but a particular one, a certain one, now it's too important to be reduced. And everybody gives it a clear vowel. In some money, some sugar, and so on, it's just some. In fact, it hasn't even got a vowel, it's just a syllable at the end, unless a vowel begins the next word. So, now here's an example of something I have had an EFL student read aloud for me, right? And they read it aloud, saying, "Father's bringing home some missionary food." Now, the point about that is that the only person who could really say that would have to be a cannibal. Okay? And the last example, and this is not quite getting it wrong. See, I've heard people come out with this expression. In fact, it used to be, those of you who practiced reading aloud intonation from the Common Grammar book will find that this very common expression, sympathizing with a person and telling them not to worry, not to be too upset, is an expression we often use. Don't take it to heart, don't consider this matter too important, be cheerful about it. But if, instead of saying to heart, you actually say the wrong, strong form of to, and say it as to, don't take it too hard, then now that to me sounds like an American saying, don't drink that coffee, it'll burn your lips, right? Don't drink it while it's too hot to drink, because Americans pronounce hot as we pronounce the word heart. So that's another way to give a funny sort of impression, a misleading impression, or an upsetting impression to somebody who's not on their guard against what you're doing. Now, we come to a point where I think we can just see if you can, anybody here can actually say some very simple sentences and get them right. So, can I have some volunteers, so at section 19 there, say any of these sentences? They get progressively harder, so if you're going to want to have a go at one, why not tell me the first one? It's the easiest one, I think. Anybody like to say that? That is relatively easy. Nobody brave enough? Well, of course, you can say it in one of two ways. The usual way to say it is the ice is melting, right? And instead of has, I've got just schwa and z. Ice is melting. And in the next one, so often I hear non-native speakers of English say, what does it mean? And do you know, no native English speaker in the whole world would ever say, what does it mean? That's absolutely the wrong rhythm. What does it mean? Sounds like a machine talking to us. It sounds like one of these computers that doesn't talk English very well. We never say, what does it mean? Because does is too strong a vowel for so weak a word, so unimportant weak. We always say, what does it mean? And probably your best target there is no vowel at all, just D and Z. And if you want to say schwa, what does it mean? Okay, that sounds reasonable. That's nice and short and weak. But what does it mean? No. Abnormal. Totally abnormal. Next one is not when am I expected, but when am I. This is the rare weak form of am. Actually, it doesn't occur very often, but there is a weak form of am. Don't confuse that with the word I'm, which is a weak form word, which you can stress or not stress. So it's not a question of weak form of that word. The word I'm, which, now, here's one of the other problems we get. I find that when a student's very good and very fluent, he begins inventing devices of his own in order to keep the rhythm as good as it should be. And he's very successful with the rhythm, but now he introduces kinds of things that we don't do. We do all sorts of reductions, but it's very unusual for an educated speaker of English to reduce the word ein by smoothing it out. Ein has this diphthong, and to reduce it to arm, very abnormal. Certain kinds of dialect do it, but it sounds quite an educated style. So it's another example of not going too far with this. You've got to get, not just make these rhythmical adjustments, you've got to do them with the right words and in the right way. So it's a difficult topic. It needs a lot of careful thought and attention, but it repays a great deal on your performance, because once you master these, your English will be 100% more natural and normal sounding and acceptable in that sense to all the English-speaking world, whatever their accent. So when am I expected, not when am I expected. The next one, not what have you got. What have you got? No native English speaker in the world would say it that way. What have you got? No. What have you got? I said it at the right speed. Right? And this is what good students do. They get very good at saying things at the right speed, but they've done the wrong thing because it sounds quite abnormal. So it's quite machine-like. They do it at the right speed but not have the right reduction. So this has to be what of with just schwa and v. And usually it wouldn't have an h. The form have, the word have reduces to have, usually at the beginning of a rhythm group, beginning of a sentence, but it's usually of without an h in turn. What have we got? Next one. What has happened? Yes, that's perfectly possible. Although we prefer usually to go even further and say what's happened. And so the word has gets reduced to just what's happened. Or what has happened. What has happened. If I say what has happened, I'm saying more emphatically than average. I'm putting a lot of emphasis on the word what. And then I've taken so much time over the word what. It's quite legitimate to do this. What has happened? If I do it with that special emphasis on what, then really I've broken the rhythm by staying so long on the word what. And now the word has is beginning its own rhythm group, and so I'm inclined to give it the schwa. But the most natural form, if I unite it with it, is what's happened. Right. How long had he had it? A number of people I've heard successfully negotiate that sentence is infinitesimal. So it's not then, how long had he had it? How long had he had it? But how long had he had it? And notice had hasn't got an H, and it's got a schwa. Longer, and he hasn't got an H, it's just he. How long had he had it? But had is the main verb, but it is possessed, so it has to have a clear verb. How long had he had it? Number 26. I shall finish soon. I shall have finished soon. Not I shall have finished, but I shall have had a schwa and have just schwa and v. I shall have finished soon. What did he have? What did he have? This is the typical question that we ask the following morning after somebody's got a hangover. You know, what was he drinking last night? What did he have that made him sick, that made him ill? Right? What did he have? So it's what had, not what had, not what had he had, or certainly not what had he had. What had he had? Oh, I get exhausted if I have all those H's. We don't like too many H's; it sounds too fussy. So we drop them on quite a scale. What did he have? What did he have? What did he have? And in this one too, had he had his Horlicks, Henry? I'm out of breath. Has Harry had his Horlicks, Henry? That's okay. Had has to have it, because it's a strong verb. It's not an auxiliary, it's not a conjugated verb. So, but his reduced no H. Has Harry had his Horlicks, Henry? Is the normal way to say. Another very simple everyday expression. That'll do. Nobody ever said that will do unless they are very angry. Like the headmaster comes into the room and finds all the children climbing on top of the desks. He will say, that will do. Right? But because he's emphasizing, because he's saying it in such a heavy sort of way, he breaks the rhythm of that. And then, of course, after breaking the rhythm, will is appropriate. In the middle of a rhythm group, that'll do. That'll do. The only way to say it. Here's another one of these expressions about inquiring how much alcohol somebody consumed the night before. If somebody is drunk as much as anybody possibly can, it's usually called a skinful. Right? Had he had a skinful? Had he been drinking a great deal? Right? Had he had? And notice that the first had has to have its strong form because it begins the sentence. But you could have a weak form on it. You say that he had, if you don't make it prominent. But we're fond of stressing the first word in a sentence, so we might give it a little bit of stress for animation. So that could well. So as I say, it's not 100%. There are places where you can get away with it. And we don't necessarily have although it's an auxiliary, we don't necessarily have the weak form initially. So either had he had a skinful, or had he had a skinful, but he is the thing that's weakened, and a is the word that's weakened in that sentence. Well, the second had must have a strong form, and the first one can either be had or had. And lastly, 31 in this lot. How many did he have? And as I say, I haven't found one EFL student in 1,000 who could say that, read that in a way that sounds like a person speaking naturally. So how many had he had? Many had he had? Matter of fact, if one says that sentence to an EFL user, they more than likely don't even understand. They're so untuned in to our weak form words that they don't recognize what's being said. How many had he had? It sounds like a sort of little cluster of noises that they can't identify. How many had he had? But that's the only natural way to say it. How many had he? So the weak form of the first had, many had he. The weak form of he, neither with H's. Schwa on the first one, just E, not E on the second one. How many had he? And then of course had, possessed, taken. So it's a main verb. How many had he had? So there you are. Well, right now, the only last comment I want to make is be careful. Don't use the wrong ones. I have heard people say things like they've invented usages we don't have. I would say, who's going out tonight? And somebody's answered something like to me, I'm. He knows that I am is used to I'm in many other situations. They can't be associated at the end of the sentence usually. I'm in front of something else. Then it's okay. And to illustrate that, I quote from this long ago musical comedy of 1930, where the brother of George Gershwin, Ira Gershwin, wrote in this song, I'm biding my time, because that's the kind of guy I'm. And of course, that was very funny. George later figured, but they know you couldn't say it that way. That's a joke, a witty, outrageous rhyme. Thank you very much for this morning.